I'm a storyteller. This is what I believe. We are all from stories, each and every one of us. We are all wired for stories. It's in our DNA. Stories are what has kept us alive. We tell our stories to transform ourselves. We tell our stories to make a difference. We tell our stories to act beyond a story that may have imprisoned us or enslaved us. We share our stories to be included. We share our stories to be understood. We share our stories to be loved. We share our stories to be respected. We share our stories to move on. I want to share with you a story of my life experience living with grandparents. At this stage of my life, I understand why my grandparents told stories the way they did. It was not just entertainment. Their stories spoke something much deeper than simply a desire to be entertained. Without our stories, how will we know it's us? Without the stories of others, how will we know who they are? I tell this because I want humans to be humane, love and respect each other's differences. Let me take you back to my childhood. I was born in Zimbabwe in the late 60s. Zimbabwe then used to be called Rhodesia, a colony of Great Britain. It was during that time that Rhodesia declared a unilateral declaration of independence and set up apartheid-based structures in the country. Privileges were now based on racial lines, benefiting the white population in the country, oppressing the black majority population. The racist apartheid government was led by Prime Minister Ian Smith. My grandfather was a rich man. He had over 100 head of cattle, many pigs, sheep, goats, and fowl. Their land was in Mvuma. The weather was hospitable. My grandfather had brick houses and barns in that beautiful place. I have fading memories. The barns were all painted white. I shared my bedroom with my little brother Kim, and we each had our own separate single beds to lie on. I loved my grandmother's kitchen, with its deep brown walls and lots of pottery that was colorfully designed. Her collection of clay pots was her pride and joy. My grandmother's name was Margaret, and my sister, who was a year older than me, was named after her. My sister Margaret was always at my grandmother's side. I can never forget how much these two Maggies were attached to each other. On the western side of this huge compound was a family burial ground. At dawn, my grandfather always woke up, walked through the burial grounds, and spoke to each of his ancestors' graves. This was a ritual, a way of life for him. His fields, the lands, were as far as the eye could see. I had two aunties and two uncles. Auntie Sylvia, always kind and warm. Auntie Diana, first ever person to teach me how to milk a cow and drinking the milk straight from the cow's udder. My uncle Ignatius, always patient with me, teaching me how to whistle. And I loved Uncle Claude, always playing tricks on everyone in the family. His sense of humor, second to none. In the late 60s, the district commissioner, a white man, came to our homestead. My grandfather welcomed him and grandmother made him a cup of tea. The man said he had come on government business as a representative of the Rhodesian government. He said our lands had been earmarked for commercial purposes, and in a month's time we were to vacate. Grandpa pinched a bit of snuff from his snuff box, took a long whiff, dusted his hands, and bellowed into a laughter. "That man is an award-winning joker," he said to my grandma when the man left. Everything continued as normal. On the 31st day in the afternoon, an empty haulage truck with a trailer pulled into our compound. This was immediately followed by a jeep filled with policemen. The police sergeant in charge was a white man, and the rest were black conscripts. We were forcibly ordered to load up the truck and trailer with our belongings and leave immediately. I was 4. I remember my grandfather shouting, "How can I leave my home, the home of my forefathers? My family and I will stay. You take your truck and officers back to where you come from." The sergeant swung his baton. The blow caught my grandfather on the jaw. He fell to the ground. He lay still. Not a muscle twitched. I cried. I thought they had killed him. Whilst my grandpa was still unconscious, the policeman tied his hands to his back and his legs, and like a piece of furniture, they shoved him in the back of the lorry. They then forced my aunts and grandpa and grandmother to load the lorry. My heart was pounding. My little hands trembled. "Move it, Pickaninny!" one of the officers shouted at me. We loaded the plowing implements, furniture from the houses. We caught as many hens as we could and put them in the baskets and loaded these as well. In the trailer, we managed to take a few cows and a bull. There was no space for the rest of the cattle, goats, sheep, and pigs. Grandpa regained consciousness. He was still tied with ropes and could not move, but he yelled and kept screaming to his ancestors for help. The lorry drove through the night. It stopped 200 kilometers away in the middle of nowhere. The lorry driver and the 2 police escorts unshackled him and drove off. In the darkness, baboons barked, hyenas cried. We even heard the distant roar of a lion. We had been dumped in Silobela, a barren, infertile, and very dangerous land. Whilst all this was going on, my father had been drafted into the Rhodesian army to help the government in its fight against the ever-growing number of blacks who had taken up arms to fight this regime. As a child, I did not understand why there was so much tension in the family whenever my father visited from the barracks. My grandfather would curse him. My aunties Sylvia and Diana uneasy with him. But what could he do? He had no choice. He had been drafted. Maybe my family would have preferred him to have run away and joined the guerrilla fighters fighting the government instead. Perhaps this was why my mother left him and moved back to her family in Harare. The day she left, I remember following her, clinging to her skirt, a strong hand gripping me by my waist, lifting me away from my mother. That was my father shouting, "You cannot take my children." So, there we were. The first days in Silobela were a nightmare. We slept out in the open. The elders guarded our livestock from the wild animals roaming about. It took time to build mud huts where we could get decent shelter, put up cattle pens, goat pens, chicken coops. We had to come to terms with living in mud huts instead of the beautiful houses we had been accustomed to. This life was unbearable, a nightmare. Once I had a bedroom that I called my own. Now I slept in the open like a wild animal. My grandfather was never the same man. We left his soul behind in Mvuma. What came to Silobela was just a shell. He was quick to anger and drank too much. I remember a few years later when a white man whose Land Rover had a puncher came to ask for a pump. What? You want my help after all you've done to me? I hate you and anyone who looks like you. Grandpa poked the man on the chest with his finger. I hate your government, bloody thieves. Sukuma wena, you won't be using my pump. So, what happened to my grandpa's lands, houses, and cattle that he left behind? A few weeks later, after we got to Silobela, my grandfather walked 15 miles to the nearest bus stop and boarded a bus to Mvuma. He came back a few days after. His face said it all. Our home in Mvuma was gone forever. The houses had been demolished. There was no trace of the rest of his livestock. His ancestors' graveyard was plowed through and planted with crops instead. Our home was now a farm given to a white man as a thank you for having served during the Second World War. My aunties Sylvia and Diana did not stay with us in the village for long. They left to find work in the cities. My uncle Ignatius went to find work in the gold mines in South Africa. My uncle Claude turned alcoholic and went away and committed suicide. So in the end, it was just us, the children, Grandpa and Grandma in the village. I still remember one Saturday afternoon back then. My grandfather sat on his stool under the shade of a big bupane tree. In his hand was a chisel chipping away small bits of wood from the axe handle he was carving. "My Kefas, bring me my beer," he yelled. Grandma was in a mud hut. She came out carrying a clay pot bubbling with home-brewed sorghum beer. She placed the pot in front of Grandpa and went back into the hut. A few minutes or so later, she came out again. In her hand was a mug. Grandma dipped the mug into the brew. It came out filled to the top, the beer fizzling and spilling out. Grandpa took a big sip. "My Kefas," he called out to my grandma. "What is this? You call this beer?" "What's wrong with it, Baba?" Grandma asked. "It's rubbish. It's shit. That's what it is," Grandpa said, and he smashed the clay pot with an axe handle he was carving. The clay pot pieces flew everywhere. The beer was now a puddle in the reddish-brown earth. Still in Grandpa's hands was the mug filled with the brew. Grandpa chucked the contents onto Grandma's face. Grandma wiped her face, turned around and walked away. "Please, let's get away from here," my little brother begged. I turned and looked at his face. His usually vibrant chocolate brown face was now ashen gray. I felt his fear. "Let's go to the river and have some fun," I said. Kim did not hesitate. On the way to the river, I sang Kim's favorite song, a song about a bream that swam upstream against all odds to get to its home. This song goes something like this. chigwaya, 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 chinofamba munzira macho, chigwaya, 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 chinofamba munzira macho, chigwaya, chinofamba munzira macho, chigwaya. We took a winding path that led to the river. Get your stick. No, that's too short. Get a longer one. By the riverbank, we spotted 2 huge crocodiles, over 2 meters long, lazing in the sun. Their mouths wide open, eyes shut, as quiet as ghosts. We sneaked up on them. With those long sticks in our hands, we poked the crocodiles in the gob. The sleeping crocodiles jolted awake, infuriated, snapping the sticks with their jaws and going after us. We ran back to a safe distance, laughing, and watched the 2 sorry crocodiles crawl back to the river. Everyone in the village hated the crocodiles. Since moving to Silovela, we had lost 3 goats and a whole big cow to these monsters. 2 weeks before, there were reports of a fisherman who had disappeared. People said he had been killed by these monsters. Now, as an adult, when I think about poking crocodiles, I would think twice about doing it. But I make up for it. I see injustices such as racism as crocodiles that need poking. If you ignore them, they will grow until they destroy your life. The more you poke them, the more the chances that they may not resurface again. I just want them to stay away. Thank you.